breaks over. It's time to return to the lady. Okay, now I'd left off putting a glaze of dark brown over the entire picture and then covering it with a layer of clear acrylic varnish. Now it's dry and I'm putting on another layer of glaze, a watered down layer of a warmed reddish brown, burnt sienna, and I'm putting that over the entire image. What I'm going to do is just sort of like rebuild the picture almost up from scratch, and we're going to reinforce and refine our shapes and edges. The darkest areas, going to fuss with the least. We're going to leave those transparent. They get thin layers of transparent dark colors. And in the lighter, brighter areas are painted with a thicker textured, more opaque paint. Now, it might seem a contradiction to go with the darks and to go thin with the darks and be thick with the lights and bright areas. But the shadows, if you paint the shadows in a thick, dark, opaque manner, they start looking dull. But if you do them with transparent layers, they hopefully will take on sort of a luminous, glowing quality, and they will have a certain aliveness about them. At the same time, they're going to sort of recede into the darkness. And the protruding planes and hills and knobs and details we had mentioned in the last video, building them up, they'll start standing out like a sculpture. Watch me speed this up now. I still wish I could paint this fast. Anyway, hopefully with all those brighter areas sticking out, it will have like a dimensional sculptural quality. The light area should seem to emerge from the darkness. An art term that painters started using in the Italian Renaissance was chiaroscuro. It says the light and the dark, and that contrast and battle between the light and the dark, it adds sort of a realism to the picture and a drama to the picture. It gives the figures more shape and drama. The Italian artists, Renaissance artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Caravaggio were masters of chiaroscuro, and the Dutchman Rembrandt was especially adept at chiaroscuro. In fact, in photography, and especially movie cinematography, they refer to the soft but dramatic lighting in an actor's face, the light that gives psychological emotional depth, as Rembrandt lighting. Now we continue to pick and pluck at the details, like introducing flesh tones, lighter flesh tones into the picture, and working our way back up. Just picking at this areas and those areas, the areas that on the forehead and the nose, the chin, a little bit of the lips, they're going to get the lighter whitish colors, and again the dark areas will be left in the blackness. Going to work on the hands a bit, always referring to our original picture, and using the same techniques I use with the face, is going over the brightest areas with the now whitish paint. I'm also revising the shape of the hands a little bit, trying to make them a little bit larger than I originally painted them. Hopefully the hand will eventually stop looking so much like a claw and more like a human hand. There's always hope. And the other hand, which was in darkness, is left more roughly painted. It has worked in the. It's less detailed and resolved. I'm going to again pluck and polish some of the details, like the necklace, reintroducing the bright scarlet red and the little white highlights in the necklace. And the necklace is a strong slash of strong primary color, and it gets echoed in the red lips of the lady, and a little more faintly echoed in the pink around her eyes. Healthy Dutch girls and even Dutch boys wore makeup in those days, and they wanted to have a smooth alabaster skin, so they powdered it with talc or even plaster to give it a whitish look. But also desirable were glowing pink cheeks and lips. They would rouge them with sienna clays mixed with with fat, bacon fat, or beeswax, and apply them. With her nice rosy cheeks and her red necklace, Our Lady seems to be perhaps ready for some social interaction. Perhaps I should get back to Geert and Rembrandt. Rembrandt was a widower, and he had an affair with his young son's nanny, Geert, who became the woman of the house for several years until a new maid showed up, a girl named Hendrika, and at that point, Geert was out and Hendrika was in. Hendrika, I think, was a more placid and agreeable person. Geert was perhaps a little high strung. But although Rembrandt tried to pay her off, she sued him for breach of promise. And there were suits and countersuits and accusations. It was sort of a bitter, uh, bitter thing. And there was a lot of money problems. This caused Rembrandt a number of money problems. Wasn't the only reason why he had money problems, but at that time, but it was one of them. We'll get back to that later. This is the picture at Wikipedia on my computer, and the nice thing about the Wikipedia is that sometimes they have some reproductions, photographic reproductions of the picture you need, and I can also enlarge it and see details in it that I couldn't see at all before with the pictures reproductions I was using before. You know, the old photocopies and books and such. But this is the most detailed one here. And I can see little bits of pink and white and details in the eyes and the pupils that I couldn't see before. So in this last stages, I'm going to be using this to help me make my corrections and such. When you're doing a copy, just try and find one good reproduction if possible, and just stick to that. And as I mentioned when I started this endeavor, this is acrylic paint. Aluminum foil over the paper plate palette helps keep things fresh, and you can keep it fresh for days. And this is a new palette to work with. And I'm going to just work on some of the areas of the forehead and flesh here, make it a little pinker and such. Now, as I started before saying, I had taken a class in reproducing old master paintings at the School of Visual Arts in New York. And at that time, the teacher of the class was a illustrator, painter named Gilbert Stone. And he was a very popular illustrator. At the time, he was in his work was in a lot of major magazines, and he did album covers and advertising campaigns. And there is a YouTube site devoted to him, and it's worth checking out. Some of his stuff is a bit 1960s, 1970s cheesy, but he was a fine draftsman, and he worked and painted all the time. In fact, they say, I didn't see this myself, but that he had a permanent callus on his forefinger and thumb, between that, where a callus where he held his painting brush. Supposedly, in fact, it was so the Grumbacher number 6 brush, which the letters were imprinted into that callus. He had held on to it so long. So, his class was very popular, and it would be all full of students, kids in their teens and early 20s, diligently reproducing their Velasquez's and Michelangelo's, Raphael's, and Rembrandt's. Gilbert Stone looked more like a Hell's Angel than what you would think as an artist. What I thought of as an artist, he'd be yelling orders to the kids, and he seems to have had some personal problems in his life. He died young, in his early 40s, which was a shame. But I'm saluting his memory now as a teacher who I consider very highly. I can stop now. Now, this may not be totally necessary, but I said I'd be using Hooker's Green Deep, and there is little direct green in the picture, but as I said, I would be using a suggestion of green. Is now's the time to use it, and I'm going to. Hooker's Green Deep is a dark and transparent green, and I'm going to put a light wash of it on sections of the painting to suggest green without directly going all deep green. I mentioned that Rembrandt rarely used direct green colors because they were expensive. Blues and greens were expensive. Ultramarine blue at that time was a mineral that was literally worth its weight in gold. And so when Rembrandt really needed blue, he used a pigment called smalt, which is really a ground up blue glass. And it was transparent and made a nice sharp blue. But somewhat unfortunately, it would fade in time and would turn dullish brown or gray. So there may be more blue in Rembrandt's paintings than is apparent today. But when Rembrandt needed a regular everyday blue, he would just mix pure black and white together. And next to the warm colors, these blues and reds and browns, that gray would look bluish. Now I'm putting some green in the background over here to and just transparent, just into the black background, just to give the hint of an additional color in there. So it'll read as black, but you'll think it's green. I'm gonna work on some more details. Get a little subtle things you always worry about, that you might lose the expression on the face, that just a tiny twitch of the eye or the eyebrow or the lips make her look too old or too young. So you just try and be as careful and as sensitive as you can, getting the highlights in the forehead and in the cheek and such. Mentioned before, Rembrandt had money troubles. He was being sued for breach of promise from a woman who had been his mistress. He still had a household. He had a maid who was now living as his wife. She had just bore him a child. And he himself probably wasn't very good with his money. He didn't save it as well, spent it kind of loosely. His paintings, which were once very popular, weren't as fashionable as they once were, partly because he was developing a rougher, more sketchy kind of style of painting that looked just unfinished to his contemporaries and potential clients. So he had mounting debts. He was living in a big house that he could no longer afford, and he could no longer afford to collect all the props and the trinkets he had accumulated. So this all led him to declare himself a bankrupt. Went to bankruptcy court, and all his effects were sold, including his printing press, which had been a source of income, and eventually had to move out of the big house that he lived in. All his auctions didn't bring him all the money he needed, and so in the last 9-10 years of his life were pretty dire, and less money accumulated. It's tragic. His beloved Hendrika died. His adult son also died. In those days, the plagues would come through towns and wipe out a third of the population sometimes. But eventually, he too succumbed to disease. He died when he was 63, and since there was no money, he was buried in the church's communal grave. Rembrandt's immediate family had all passed on or scattered, and his only assets were a large stockpile of paintings that his contemporaries thought were too sketchy or unfinished to sell or use. So when he was buried in a communal grave, the remains were labeled and held on to until friends or family could claim the body and pay for a proper grave and a proper ceremony. But no one ever came for Rembrandt's body, and after a time it, like the other unclaimed remains, was disposed of. So there's no official resting place for Rembrandt. His reputation wasn't very high at his death. It's more of a great talent that had become unfocused and eccentric. It wasn't until the mid-1800s, 200 years after his death, that he was recognized as a profound painter, and his reputation rose. And the value of his paintings rose, too, and became prized possessions in collections and museums. So they finally placed a big bas-relief in the church in Amsterdam, where his body was stored at for a time. And his name grew in fame and became synonymous as a symbol of great painting and great artistry. There's even a line of paints and art supplies with the brand name Rembrandt, which is a shame because he could have used those royalties when he was alive. Now I'm fussing with details in the eyes, just getting the tiny highlights in the irises and pupils. It can make a painted portrait really look alive if you can get the eyes lit just right. Just working just with plain gray here. I don't really like that. Well, if you get it wrong, you can always just wipe it out and try again. Nice thing about acrylic paint is that it's forgiving. You can just wipe it out and start over again. I think that's a little better. Anyway, I was talking about being in art school and being a student back in the day. And in the day of Rembrandt, they didn't have art schools per se, but master artists had workshops that were full of apprentices and followers, pupils, who would be working to assist the master artist and work with him, and receiving lessons in drawing and etching and painting. In the meantime, assisting him, grinding his pigments and preparing the canvases and the etching plates, but learning all the techniques of of being an artist before they themselves would set out and hang up their shingle to be a professional. Rembrandt had many students during his long 40-year career, and many learned his techniques well, maybe too well. In the workshop environment, the master and the student would collaborate on paintings, with the master roughly sketching images, and the students can fill in the colors and details, and maybe the master might even sign the work and sell it as his own. This is signed by Rembrandt. So, but so is it possible, after all this time we've spent here, all this time and fuss, that this really isn't a Rembrandt at all? About 100 years ago, it was believed that there were nearly 700 Rembrandts in the world, but today arts experts have whittled down that number by nearly half. There are some experts that now believe that our young lady here is really the work of a talented pupil of Rembrandt's named Samuel van Hoogstraten. Here's a Hoogstraten self-portrait. Does look kind of Rembrandty. Even the Art Institute of Chicago, which has owned this painting for 120 years, and for 100 of those years called it a Rembrandt, it's now somewhat downgraded it to as a piece of the workshop of Rembrandt. Humans, being what they are, used to go ooh and ah over the Rembrandt they saw, but now that it's just a workshop of Rembrandt piece, they pass it by rather quickly to get to the real McCoys, which is a real shame, because this is a beautiful painting. And not everybody agrees that it isn't a Rembrandt, too. The art historian Simon Schama believes that Rembrandt's hand is in it. And so we'll hear from him in a minute. Just taking our time looking at the hair, little lights in the collar highlighting. You can go almost pure white on some of these areas, and they will fade, they will darken and become part of the painting. So working on the coloring. Okay. An expert who has cast doubt on the total attribution to Hoogstraten is Simon Schama in his book Rembrandt's Eyes. A very good book, and he discusses the young woman at the half-open door. Here it is here. And he says, for although Hoogstraten's clearly demonstrates an unbounded confidence in trying out Rembrandt's broadest manner of brushstroke, it's actually the fine work in the girl's hair and the exceptional beautiful shading of her face, especially at the corner of her mouth, as well as the subtle highlights in her right upper eyelid, are completely beyond Hoogstraten's style at that time. There is also the matter of the half-turned, watchful, almost suspicious head, avoiding the usual ingratiating gaze at the beholder, and never, in all the countless imitations and variations of servants at the door that appeared later in the 17th and through the 18th and 19th centuries, ever recurring. Continue from Simon Schama's book. Could it be that the painting is a case where the master and his student collaborated on the same composition? It's quite easy to imagine Hoogstraten sketching in the essential design, perhaps taking a good look at Geert Dirks as he did so, for the woman wears a dress characteristic of the Waterland villages from which Rembrandt's mistress came. Then he may have worked up a sketch to some point where the master then provided the crucial finishing touches, and thus, with some real justification, put his own signature to it. In any event, Hoogstraten, who was on his way to becoming an accomplished poet as well as a painter, was not one likely to hide behind his master for very long. Thus writes Simon Schama in the book Rembrandt Eyes, Alfred A. Knopf, 1999, page 523. Right now I am adding a simple gray, just simple black and white, to fill in the background and to give a light source down in the lower corner of where her right hand is, and also around her body to give lighter areas around her body, not quite a halo, but something to give her a glow and set her off from the rest of the background. Anyway, Hoogstraten was an interesting fellow. Samuel van Hoogstraten was. He was a well-known painter in his time, and after his time with Rembrandt, he developed a slicker, more fashionable style, as you can see here. And as we stated, he was also a poet, and a playwright, and a politician, and an author who wrote a book about painting in the 1670s, and some of the things we know about Rembrandt and his studio come directly from the Hoogstraten book. Just taking care of the background, touching up little areas. A little more lights around the shoulders, maybe around the collar and around the neck and the head that gave it stand out. I'm intrigued by the authorship, and I love this painting. It seems to me to have more soul than any other of the Hoogstratens I've seen. I still feel it's a Rembrandt or has Rembrandt's DNA in it, but what do I know? And now we can finish doing details on the wooden door using yellow and ochre and our two browns, the burnt sienna and burnt umber. Well, after seeming interminable amount of fussing with details and such, we're probably ready to give it just the final finishing glazes and such. So I'm going to just go over some areas with the umber and black, just to get some areas darker. And when you're dealing with a picture for so long, you sort of like get a relation with it, especially if it's a human. When I was doing research on this painting, I read about a woman who used to go to visit this painting in the museum in Chicago and visited at least once a week for nearly 30 years and used to silently talk about it and discuss her week and such. So perhaps that's crazy, but a work of art, people do develop very personal relations with them. With the things like the dress, because it's dark, I'm adding a little bit of black and brown to it, but you don't want it to turn totally black. You want to see a little bits of color peeping through it and giving it some depth. This hand that's in the shadow can be darkened. The background gets a little bit more darkness. And it gets a patina color. That's a little too dark, so In case I go too dark on anything, I can just skip back and just lighten a few things. But we're really sort of getting ready to say goodbye to the young lady. You notice that when it comes to her, near her shoulder and area, arms, it gets a little lighter to give it a glow. Okay, I'm going to let that dry, and then we'll give it a final glaze. And now this is putting another coat of the gloss medium and varnish over the entire painting, which will dry clear and transparent and glossy. Okay, now as a final step, I am going to spray this with a clear matte finish over here. It will take off the shine that the gloss medium has put on it, and it will make it look a little smoother. If you want to make changes in the painting later on, you certainly can. You can work over it, but this will be the finishing touch on this. So, because it's a bit noxious, I'm going to be spraying it over there. See? I'm spraying it over here. Yep, I caught it. There we go. Okay, well, this is the final product, and we've come to the end of our project here. And originally, I had named this Tim's Rembrandt in honor of Tim's Vermeer, but I guess we'll have to end up calling it Tim's Hoogstraten. Fine painting anyway. Thank you. Bye.